Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Craftsy Chats. My name is Leah, and I will be officially introducing our instructor for today's Q&A in just a moment. But a few little quick reminders from me. First of all, I am your moderator for a reason. We want your questions. So that chat box is right there for you to use the entire time that we are here with you today. A few of you have already dropped some questions in, and we would love to answer as many as we have time to today. So please, please, please drop in your questions for Colette, and she will get to as many as possible. Also, if you're joining us after last week's 5-day Craftsgiving mini-series, welcome back. If you didn't check out any of those crafts, please go ahead and search those out. All of our instructions, step-by-step demonstrations from last week are available for replay, as well as all of the patterns and recipes from the project. So I know we have a fantastic team back behind the scenes. Maybe they'll drop a little link in for those Craftsgiving projects into the chat box as well. But without further ado, that's all I have. So it is time to say welcome, Colette. Hello, thank you for being with us. How are you today?
Oh, Leah, I'm doing terrific. I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here. This is like an annual event for us to take my questions and help everyone with their Thanksgiving baking.
I know, I've really been looking forward to this.
I always look forward to this. Totally. This is like the best time of year for baking. And I'm happy to report that I don't have to bake hundreds of pies this year. So I am on a cloud.
All right. Well, is there anything that you want to bring, little reminders, any updates on what you've been up to before we start to get into the questions?
What I've been up to is just sort of expanding my social media, expanding my blog and my website at bakingwithcolette.com, which has a lot of great recipes. If you scroll through, I do put a lot of time. Sometimes I feel, Leah, that nobody reads it, but I do put a lot of heart. I almost thought of calling it the blog that nobody reads. So, so if bakers, if you want to scroll through, please come to the blog.
All right. Well, we'll give you bakingwithcolette.com, and I'll give you a little chance at the end to shout out that blog as well for anybody that's not here at the beginning. All right, well, with that said, let's dive into some questions here. We have Lisa's coming first. So Lisa says, I used just egg for my pecan pie, and it just made the filling syrup. Did I use too much egg substitute? What do you think?
It's very important when working with egg substitutes to follow that whatever it says on the package, whether it's Bob's Red Mill, the other brand, the main brand is escaping me right now, but really to make sure that you're following the directions, and I'm sure you did, Lisa, but to make sure that you've got the proportions correct. The egg substitutes really do have a little bit of challenge with coagulation. So immediately what comes to mind is maybe adding a little flaxseed and water, ground flaxseed and water mixed up to your next to the next pecan pie custard that you make. That may take a little experimentation, but my day job, I teach for Escoffier School of Culinary Arts, and we put together a plant-based program. And for the plant-based baking, we did use a lot of flaxseed as thickener, even more so than the egg replacers. That was a long-winded reply, but I hope it helps. And please, if you'd like further, if you'd like me to take a look at the formula, you can reach out to me, and maybe toward the end, I'll also share my email with you guys. If you would like to reach out, I'm happy to help you with formulas or recipes.
All right, perfect. And Lisa, you can always drop anything more specific into the chat. We can always revisit this question a little bit later. But for now, we're going to move on to Carol's question next. Carol says, instead of turkey, we have a savory vegetable pie every Thanksgiving. That sounds pretty fantastic. So Carol wants to know, what is the difference between a pie crust for a savory pie and one that you're making for a sweet pie?
Nothing except everything's the same except the sugar. I would leave the sugar. Okay, so here's the thing. You could keep a little bit of the sugar in, let's say a regular pie crust formula has very little sugar in it.
Hmm.
But sometimes it will be in a recipe because it adds a little bit of sweetness, obviously, but it also aids in crust caramelization. So you'll notice if you back out 100% of the sugar in a pie crust, what happens is it may bake up pale because in order for so if you take out the sugar, what has to caramelize is the starches in the flour. And in order for that to happen, we have to raise that temperature. Okay, so maybe keep a small amount of sugar in the formula, not so much you taste it, but just enough to aid with caramelization and browning. However, the difference between a savory and sweet pie crust are usually very little. What gets backed out is either all or just a small amount of the sugar would be added. So let's say for a regular, see, you got me going. I'm off and running. You guys know, right? So let's say, for example, you have a regular two crust pie crust that probably has 15 grams or a tablespoon of sugar in it. I would back that out to maybe 3/4 of a teaspoon. You won't taste it, but it'll kick in during the baking processes and give you a lovely crust. All right, Leah.
Well, if you are just joining us for a Q&A with Colette, guaranteed you're going to get nice, detailed answers to your questions. And Colette, people love them. They love the details. So keep them coming and we'll get to all of these questions. We've got a good one next. I'm actually pretty curious about this one. And this is from Sherry. So Sherry is curious what your opinion is, Colette, of glass pie pans versus the non-stick metal pie pans. What do you think?
Oh, so many opinions. I prefer a metal pie pan 9 times out of 10
Mhm.
because metal conducts heat better than glass. However, our good friends at Corningware and Pyrex, which might be the same thing, they work very hard to wave their magic wands and get their pans to conduct heat. So but metal is always going to conduct heat better. So it's easier to get more crust browning in a metal pan and get a little bit more heat to the inside. And I'm talking visualize your filling, visualize that crust right under that filling to get that bake all the way through. So that's the benefit of metal. That now the benefit of glass, which we all like, is we can see it.
Yes.
So you can see the crust browning. The one thing though, with a metal pan, we can raise the temperature a little bit more than we can with a glass pie pan. If you read the manufacturer's directions carefully, they will actually ask you not to go, it's either 375 or 400. Not
Mhm.
that, I mean, that glass is fired at an intense heat, but they're always worried about that one time.
Yeah. All right. Well, opinions galore on the glass versus the metal. I have glass pans myself, so I'm glad to have heard that answer. Maybe I'll have to go get a metal one. Yes.
Well, no, the other thing you can do is you can preheat a cookie sheet,
Ooh.
and then the glass goes right on it, and that gets a little bit of bottom heat quick. You can
Hmm.
also do this if you like to use a ceramic pan, because ceramic pans are not great conductors of heat. It takes a long time for them to heat up. And then you can have, and don't forget to put foil down on that sheet just in
Right.
case the pie burbles over. But it's always a good idea to bake our pies on a lined baking sheet, but we don't always. I learned that preheating in a professional kitchen,
Mm.
preheating the pie sheet, the cookie, I can't talk, preheating the baking tray so you get some intense heat quickly. It's actually a trick that we would use for souffles. I worked at the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston way back when, and we actually had a souffle station, and we were kept very tight times on producing those souffles. So the pastry chef would preheat the sheet, that he would preheat baking trays. And I thought, my God, why couldn't we do that for pies? And we can. So that would be another, let's get that bottom hot fast.
All right. I'm going to have to try that. All right. And if anybody else out there has tried that, go ahead and drop in the comments how it's gone for you. We like to crowdsource some of these questions as well. We're going to move on to Sheila's question next, Colette. So Sheila is looking for the best non-dairy cream substitute, also a non-dairy butter substitute. Allergic to lactose products, loves all of your French pastries and things, and is looking for your input on something for that.
As far as non-dairy cream substitutes, there is a product called Silk that worked very well when we were developing the plant-based program, baking formula recipes at Escoffier. I'd have to really Silk, and it was working extremely well. I'm so sorry. I'm just kind of blanking on the full, I think that's the full name. That seems to be the carton that I grabbed out of the store. And then also, I think Earth Balance is the most mainstream non-dairy butter substitute that we can find that is reasonably priced. I know there are a couple out there that you can order. I think there's one called Fleur. But to me, I mean, I'm willing to invest in my baking, but I felt this was very expensive. And in testing, we found Earth Balance to work very well. It's just with any of the non-dairy fats, you've got to work cold. You may be working, you may want to chill them, especially for making a pie crust. You maybe want to, Katie, our behind the scenes fabulous guest, thank you. You might want to actually 20 minutes in the freezer with Earth Balance can really help when you are, you want to use cold fat for pie crust. And anytime you're doing a cut in dough. And then for the laminated doughs, we would work in and out of the freezer a little bit more, like I talk about in Classic Croissants Modern Techniques, where when we're in between turns, and that's the Craftsy Classic Croissants Modern Techniques, should qualify that. We are in and out of the freezer 15 minutes, and then we move to the refrigerator in between turns.
Okay, let's go to, I believe it's Carol, maybe Carol Lee. I'm sorry if I got that wrong, has our next question. So first of all, Carol was looking for your blog that you mentioned. So yes, our fantastic behind the scenes team has put the link to Colette's blog into the chat box. There are a couple of you that were in the comments interested in it. That link is there for you. Check that out when you have the time and get more Colette a little bit later after we have to say goodbye. And then we'll go to Carol's question. And Carol is curious about lard versus Crisco. Which do you think is better, Colette, and why?
Well, lard makes an exquisite pie crust. It's just flaky, and if you can get leaf lard, that's if you live in an area where that's available, that's amazing. But like, regular lard is going to give you a very flaky crust. I find, however, I'm not a big fan of the flavor, but especially we were referencing savory pies earlier. There is usually, and all of a sudden the Great British Baking Show comes into my head, and I was thinking about their challenges when they would do savory pies. And for the hot water crust, there's usually lard in there. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the flavor, love the flake. I'm more of a partial butter, partial vegetable shortening. That's my favorite go-to crust.
Okay, now this is really general. Moving into our next question, this comes from Maggie. And Maggie says that pie crust is just a challenge for Maggie. So, do you have any tips for somebody that finds trouble just with pie crust in general?
I have a follow-up question. Where is the landmine for Maggie? What part of the process does she find challenging?
All right, I'll keep an eye out for that answer.
But let me just say in general, because pre-pandemic, I taught pie crust when I was working part-time at Sur La Table. This time of year, it felt like 24/7. And so where there is difficulty with pie crust is usually, we're certainly capable of mixing our dry ingredients. We're pretty good at cutting up the fat, and we want it to be about the size of cornflakes, because then we have nice, we've got that will really encourage good flakiness. And the Craftsy class for pies, I'm going to have to ask our behind the scene person to Katie to bring up the link for, oh my God, or I am not, I'm not getting senile, you guys, I promise. But when you watch her class, the pieces of fat are huge, and the reason that encourages flake. So we're usually pretty good with chopping in the fat. We know that to use cold fat. The biggest, the biggest struggle, and I've saw this thousands of times, is adding the liquid. What we have to do as we're mixing is to go on faith and know that we need to keep working it in and work the moisture through the dough and resist the temptation to add more liquid. If at any point that pie dough gets sticky, it's toast.
Well, Maggie did just drop in that it's tough. So, I believe we're talking about the pie crust gets tough here.
Then what's happening is it's being overworked.
Mm.
So back in the day, and maybe you have in your family, the audience, this happens. The mythic pie baker, and past, present, and future. It's like the ghost of pie bakers, past, present, and future. And people would, everybody talks romantically about this baker's pies, right? They kept a light touch. So as we're mixing, and my favorite tool is a plastic bowl scraper for mixing my pie dough. They're made by Ateco, they're made by many companies, a thin white plastic bowl scraper. I could run and grab one if you would bear with me. But this tool, literally, and a good size bowl, you're literally folding the dry ingredients, wet ingredients, and that fat. It's hard to explain it. That works really well. And then when we get it out of the bowl, just that final mix is really light. And last thing, I promise, you can also use your mixer. You can pulse it off and on and get that dough into a cohesive mass using the paddle attachment. In a commercial bakery, if they're making their own pie crust, they are most certainly using the mixer. And I bet I got a lot of wheels turning with suggesting using the mixer to make your pie crust, because 9 times out of 10, we think, oh my God, I have to make this by hand.
All right, we do have a link put in from our tech team. So a little start off for the Craftsy. It looks like it's from the startup library, crusts and pastries. So there's a link there for anybody looking for like what you called out, Colette. And then I'm going to combine a couple of our viewers have very similar questions. This is going back to the preheating that we talked about if you're using a glass pie pan. So this is Janice, Pamela, and Mary Louise. Curious if a ceramic pie pan would work, or can you heat the glass on top of a ceramic or steel pizza pan? Do you want to talk a little bit about those options?
Too hot.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I know you're gonna, that might sound weird, right? Why did she say we can preheat a baking tray, but
Mhm.
can't use can't use a ceramic or steel pizza pan? Excellent thought. I really like how the thinking is going. But immediately my spidey baker safety um, sense is like, no, the pizza pan can really hold heat. All right. That being said, though, let me just say, I do keep a pizza stone 24/7 in my oven, but I usually take it out because it helps regulate the heat in my oven. But when I make pies, I take it out and I just preheat my regular baking tray, and then I'll put my pie pan on it to get that bottom crust. So, in a nutshell, I could be totally bonkers, but I do know that the pizza baking stones, steel or ceramic, hold so much heat. Just that one time that you would put a glass or ceramic pie dish on it, that it might crack it.
Okay, and then we're going to stay on this subject for just one more to touch base with Luna. So, Luna joined in the middle of our original conversation about this and is curious about aluminum. We actually didn't mention aluminum, but did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Aluminum pie pans,
I believe so.
most most of the equipment you buy, a metal pie pan is 100% aluminum because it is such a great conductor of heat.
All right, and then let's throw back to our non-dairy conversation with our next question. This comes from Clarice. So people that have that lactose allergy, Clarice has a client who cannot do lactose but can use Kerrygold butter. So what is your opinion on using that?
That's an unusual.
Hmm.
That's unusual. That's my first comment. Kerrygold is a fabulous product, but because the cows are grass fed, that butter has a tendency to soften very quickly. So what I would do for my Kerrygold pie crust, I would weigh out my butter, cut it up into small cubes, and freeze it, handling it almost like we handle shortening in a pie crust. A real game changer is to freeze your shortening before mixing it into your pie crust. And if you're doing a butter shortening combo pie crust, the butter goes in first because the butter takes more effort to cut into the dry ingredients. Even super cold and frozen, you'll notice that the shortening will go in very quickly.
All right, so for anybody out there using Kerrygold, hopefully that is helpful as well. We're going to veer just a little bit away from pies for a little bit of variety with our next question. This is from Lauren. So, Lauren is making a cranberry upside down cake that she saw on Pinterest. Super excited for it and wants to know, Colette, if you have any tips specifically looking to avoid undercooking this project.
What's very important is to make sure you bake it long enough. A
Yeah.
lot of times what happens to us at home, when we're baking at home, we get very fixated on how long the recipe tells us to bake. But you guys have great baker's instincts. You're watching Craftsy chats. That's a clear indicator you have great baker's instincts. And the other thing too is that needs to be baked long enough. I actually may have a recipe for something like that on the website. I've been writing it for so many years, I forget what's on there. But the important thing is, normally it's like you're going to put your cranberries in the bottom, and then you're going to have, and I would recommend a piece of parchment paper on the bottom of the pan. Then you do your filling, and then usually it's like a buttermilk or like a pound cakey golden cake. And it's really going to be absolutely scrumptious, I have no doubt. The baking temp is usually 350, totally normal for cakes. but depending on the size, 8, 9, or 10-inch, you want to make sure that you let it stay in there and bake before checking, probably a good 30 minutes. And then pull it out, close that oven door, take a skewer, a cake tester, test the center, and if it comes out clean or just maybe a few little crumbs sticking to the end of the cake tester, you are you're fine. However, that being said, you guys, if you have doubts, you can always put product back in the oven for a few more minutes, even turning off the heat, just to make sure that you get that product done in the center. Professionals do that all the time. And I'm having tremendous luck with croissants by baking them for 375 at 30 minutes, then turning off the oven, especially like the Parisian ones, that are hard to bake in the center, and leaving them in there without the heat on for 5 minutes, just to draw out the excess moisture. If we were in a professional baking program, I would run you through the baking processes. But because a lot of times that can seem like kind of boring, but just that being said, one of the most important baking processes is baking out excess moisture. So that's not to bake things until they're dry, but just to make sure, like in this beautiful cranberry upside down cake, that that nothing's raw or streaky in the center, that it's a full, beautiful, tender, golden, buttery, sweet, scrumptious bake.
All right. That made it sound really fantastic there. Good luck with your bake. We're going to go back to pies with Carol. So these are actually all different Carols. We just have a lot of Carols watching today. So hello and welcome. So our third question from a Carol is about blackberry pie. So Carol is making a 2-crust blackberry pie and is curious, should she pre-bake the bottom crust? And if so, how long and at what temperature should she be baking the whole pie?
For a fruit filling that is very liquidy, without any kind of a barrier, like a cream cheese, that's almost a stumper, Leah, and we don't get stumped very often. My gut feeling, my expert gut feeling is pre-bake it. Then if you have any crumb topping or streusel hanging around, sprinkle some in the bottom. Like 2 tablespoons, just a little bit, a little light layer, and then the filling. And that pie is going to be par baked, not fully baked, because we have to bake it enough to thicken the filling, right? So it's just a par bake, just enough to get that pie base opaque and maybe the softest golden bake on it. The layer of crumb topping or streusel will soak up excess liquid. And by the way, that tip, that comes from my grandmother's baking book when she took cooking classes in Chicago in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Their apple pie recipe, and I don't know if anyone will remember, this is going to sound like outer space, but this school was called the Antoinette Pope School of Fine Cookery. And it wasn't like culinary school, but it was cooking classes for passionate home cooks and people who were, at that time, if families could afford them, they would hire a cook. And this school trained cooks for domestic service as well. And that's where as a matter of fact, but in the old days, they would use, in my grandmother's cookbook, they used breadcrumbs to absorb excess moisture. But I was like, no, 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 we can really make this cool and do a little crumb topping or streusel, which keeps in the freezer for 6 months, no problem at all. And I think I have a very good streusel recipe in Danish from scratch. I think Danish from scratch. You can always find me and I'll shoot you one.
All right, let's move on to macarons for just a moment here.
Ooh, of course.
So Clarice is making an herbed cheese filling type macaron, and so is asking if you have any tips on making savory macarons where the shells themselves are not as sweet. So what would the almond flour to powdered sugar ratio be in that case?
Well, I'll tell you, that's the hardest macaron to do. And in France, they just make them straight. They don't even mess with it. They
Okay.
just make a savory, savory filling. I wrote a book in 2018 called Mastering Macarons, Classic to wait, what did I call that? Yeah, Classic to Contemporary Techniques. It's available through armorready.com, and I have a savory macaron in there. Honest to God, there's no clear, and that savory macaron was a ton and ton of testing. So actually, if I will, if I'm so sorry, not Carol again, or who was our
Clarice.
Clarice. If she would like to DM me, I'll take a photo of it and I'll send it to her.
Right, sounds good. I'm going to put this next question not just to Colette, but we can crowdsource this one as well. So we are looking specifically for a manufacturer who makes a pie pan slash dish that is bigger than 12 or 14 inches. So think the size pies that you might be purchasing at Costco. Looking for this specifically because we're looking to make a huge apple pie in an air baked jelly roll pan, and we love lots and lots and lots of pie. So, do you have any tips on baking in a larger pan like this? And then also, if you have any sourcing ideas, Colette, you and then anybody else watching, if you have these, drop it into the comments.
Totally going to need help with that. I
All
would
right.
guess that's a commercial pan that they're using. And of course the Costco ones are disposable, so they
Mhm.
have a manufacturer make them for them. Wow. Follow-up question, and does it have to be round?
Um, I will keep an eye on that.
Because you can make a rectangle apple pie, and maybe our audience remembers, this is so old school, but they were called apple slices. If
Mm.
anybody grew up in the 70s, and it was a 2-layer apple pie, and then it was covered with then they would put poured fondant on the top or
Mhm.
flat icing. Yummy, yummy, yummy. Oh my God, it was my treat after ice skating. It was so totally awesome. My ice skating lesson. Um, so anyway, I digress about ice skating, but it can be any shape.
Yes,
But
it does not have to be round.
okay,
Just
then
specified.
there are large cake pans available. And what about using a full-size sheet pan and maybe building up an aluminum foil collar around the edge, lightly greasing that collar, and then, or yeah, because I don't want it too, well, the other thing that are they make rectangular cake frames that literally go onto a top of a full-size sheet pan. So we're talking 18 by 26, and you have to have a commercial, that's about as big as I think you can go.
Mhm.
And then you need a commercial oven to bake this sucker in, because our home ovens, unless you have a commercial range at home, are not large enough. God, I hope that helped. That helped. But that was almost a stumper. Almost.
We do have a bit of crowdsourcing as well. So, some suggestions to try a restaurant supply store, also using a larger cake pan, a metal cake pan, something like that. So keep those suggestions coming into the chat box, and hopefully that will be helpful. Let's go on to Susan's question next. So Susan wants to talk lemon meringue pies. So
Ooh.
Susan has had trouble in the past getting them to set. Once it seemed like it was set, I put on the meringue and I followed the instructions. Still trouble. Do you have any tips, Colette?
The best thing to do is follow a recipe, and
Mhm.
I think the one from Cooks Illustrated is the best, and it's where it has cornstarch added to the meringue because you need that stabilization.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it can really be a mess. There's also a wonderful book, if you're into baking science, called Bakewise by Shirley Corrier, Corriher, and she goes into great depth in that book. When I met her, she was kind of moving up in years. She may have passed on. This book is, if she hasn't, she is deep into her dotage, and I don't know how much she's writing. But that book went into intense detail about working that meringue, adding that cornstarch, stabilizing it. You need a little bit of the stabilization, and it acts as a dryer. So that helps that meringue set really beautifully. Lemon meringue pie, you guys, is a beast. So if you master it, pat yourselves on your baking shoulder and say, look, I'm a boss. And if it takes a couple tries, just be patient because it is a challenge. There's a reason you don't see them on every street corner.
Mhm. Ooh, Phil's got a good question for us to tackle next. So Phil says, I know this isn't pastry, but do you have any tips for creme brulee? My dad used to make it, and I want to take up the tradition, but I'm feeling a little intimidated. What do you think?
First of all, one, it's a great dessert for Thanksgiving.
Mhm.
Two, it is actually quite simple to make. The challenge is not over baking it, and you're going to bake it you're going to bake it in a water bath at 325 degrees, and you're going to bake it. Here's the tagline: creme brulee and most custards are baked until they jiggle like jello. They don't ripple like soup.
Mm.
So that is, and it's really best to get. You probably have them. If your dad made creme brulee, the traditional creme brulee dishes,
Mhm.
and then you're going to use like a cookie sheet, like a 13 by 18 cookie sheet, and you're going to have the water a third of the way up the. Some sources will say half, but it's real easy to get sloshy. But I'd like to ask, what's the most intimate? When you think about making it, what's the scariest part?
All right. We'll come back to that if I see that clarification drop in. In the meantime, Susan wanted to clarify about the lemon meringue. So the trouble that Susan's having is actually with the filling of the pie. So apparently
Ooh,
it only looks set. Then when the meringue goes on top, it turns out not so much. What do you think about that?
it should, in theory, stay set. I'd be very curious to see the recipe and look at the percentages for the custard. And maybe what I would recommend is you can find that Cook's Illustrated recipe and
Mhm.
maybe compare your filling, because there's something up with the filling. We put the meringue on, typically, we put it back in the oven, and we brown the meringue in the oven, and the filling should stay put. It should not become liquidy. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
that uh, immediately I would flag that recipe and take a look at it.
Okay. Yeah, Susan, keep on the clarifications coming if we want to revisit that again later. We'll do that. In the meantime, Pamela wants to know, Colette, have you ever added bacon fat to pie crust dough?
No, but my step grandmother used to. She
Mm,
kept a can of bacon grease in a coffee can to cook eggs, and every so often she would make like when she made chicken pot pie, she would add a little bit of bacon fat. Again, just our rule with fats, freeze it
mhm.
because it's going to go in. And I wouldn't do a huge, like she would just do like a dollop, like, because that was the dolloping age of baking. But I tell you guys, if our grandmothers or great grandmothers or great great grandmothers had scales, my God, they would have used them. Because how bizarre is a formula that tells you a wine glass of milk, a walnut size? What? No. So I would say definitely chill or freeze the bacon and keep the amount. So let's say if your formula calls for 6 ounces of butter, right, or 6 ounces of shortening, then I might just use 2 ounces of the bacon just to give it a little bit of savory. And that could be kind of awesome for a little bit of sweet and savory variation. And I'm surprised like that hasn't that's a great idea.
Okay, we're going to venture away from pies again for another moment here. Not a pie question, but a scone question.
Ooh.
Some scones are made with butter and some are not. What is the advantage or disadvantage of each? And do you have a preference? This is coming from another tradition, usually making cream scones the Sunday morning after Thanksgiving, but wondering about those with butter.
Okay. So the cream scone has a gorgeous texture,
Mhm.
more of an all over texture, not as flaky. An all over soft, buttery, how can I describe it? A little bit more cake like. And then when we make our scones with butter, and we have usually the liquid is milk or buttermilk. It doesn't have as much as a high fat content. So the gluten strands that we create are not as coated. You'll notice a little bit more layers because what fat does to gluten is it coats the strands. So cream scone made with cream, again, a higher fat content. So we get a softer, more cake-like crumb. In a butter scone made with buttermilk or milk, you'll get a more definitive flake. They're both delicious. They're both really good. Cream scones, sometimes they bake up. They'll be a little bit more, God, I'm like, they're a little bit more rounded on the edges, not as little bit softer sided. And the most important thing with either of the scones, you want to make sure, don't forget to brush with heavy cream or brush with the buttermilk or even just plain milk because that lactic acid softens the crust, and that's very characteristic of either uh, butter, cream, or non-cream scones is to have that beautiful soft flake, that beautiful soft top crust to bite into. I hope that helps.
All right, I'm sure that will be helpful. It brought me back to memories of scones when I was working on a cruise ship, and every day at 2 o'clock they would have a different scone. So let's go to Ali's question next. The pie crust recipe that I use calls for half softened butter and half shortening. And then I also add 1 tablespoon of vodka, which is supposed to make the crust a little more flaky. Is
Mhm.
there any disadvantage to using soft butter? And have you heard of adding vodka before?
Oh, yes. Cooks Illustrated made the vodka thing famous about 10,000 years ago. Sometime, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s, they came up with that one. The other thing you can use is a vinegar, like a lemon juice or apple cider vinegar. And what it does is the alcohol or the vinegar is the is it helps it helps with it cuts the gluten strands, so it inhibits that fat coating coating the flour mixture. It helps with flake. So it's a gluten inhibitor. That's what it is. So that's the purpose of the vodka. And then talking about our mythic family bakers, past and present, apple cider vinegar was like the American, like, Mrs. Lincoln's 1888 Fannie Farmer cookbooks would always have that little bit of acid in there to inhibit that gluten formation. Was there a second part of that question, Leah?
Just had you heard of adding vodka? Was there any disadvantage to using the soft butter?
The soft butter blows my mind. To me, that would immediately grease the gluten strands unless you're mixing really, really fast, because we pretty much always want to work with cold fat, because but if it works, it works. That's totally fine. But it is definitely a norm buster.
Okay,
but go for it if you're happy.
We're all enjoying a little bit of nostalgia with this. Some people are mentioning that this is reminding them of their parents, grandparents' favorite pies. Twyla's mom made the best lemon meringue pie. And we're wondering out there, Colette, what is your favorite savory pie?
Like a steak and mushroom Guinness, pie. I'd probably have to be in like Yorkshire or Bath, or I'd have to be across the pond, just one of those like really marvelous hot water crust English pies. It has to be, you can't be in LA. It's got to be pretty nippy and a good 5-mile walk. And then, yes, so that would be my, I would say beef and mushroom and a good Guinness gravy.
Fantastic. All right, it's my turn to jump in and remind you, if you are holding on to a question and you haven't put it into the chat box yet, please do so right now. I just looked at the clock. We are hitting that last little chunk of time, so we'll get to as many as possible. Colette, I'm going to take you back a little bit towards the beginning of our time with Megan's question. Megan said, sorry, was a few minutes late joining, and has a question about the metal versus glass pie pans that we started with. What do you think about a stoneware pan like a Le Creuset enamel-lined stoneware pan?
They're great. They're beautiful pans. I would rather have that than like a straight up ceramic pan, because you've got that layer of cast iron that's going to, you put the pie in the oven, and definitely I would put that on preheated pan. The marriage of the preheated pan and the Le Creuset pan, golden, totally. Yes, I think you'll have a good result.
Okay, let's do Sheila's question here. Do you have any tips, Colette, for adding cinnamon to a pie crust? One of my favorite sour cream apple pie recipes has cinnamon in the pie dough. What do you think?
Sounds good. You can customize but I would sift it in with the flour. Sift the cinnamon in with the flour. And a good rule of thumb, you guys, whenever you're working with cinnamon, cocoa, ginger, nutmeg, spices like that, or cocoa, you want to make sure that is evenly dispersed. So if it needs a second sift and your baker's intuition is like, clumpy, give it another sift. But okay. Yes, absolutely. That would be delicious.
And then what would you say to any of our bakers out there that are needing to create a gluten-free pie crust? What would you recommend for that recipe?
Oh my goodness. Another big part of why I was so underground last year was developing a gluten-free bread program for Escoffier, which is my day job, and teaching for them. And there is a flour out there. I'm going to give a shout out to Gluten-free Jules, Jules, works the best. And her website is super extensive for gluten-free. And I would really, really recommend using her flour. That was the flour where we really had good luck across the spectrum of recipes we were testing. That being said, When you're working gluten-free, it's not going to hydrate like regular flour, which all of us who bake gluten-free know, and just know that it might be a bit of trial and error. Keep those fats cold. And it might be a place where use the mixer with the paddle attachment if you have it. And when you use the mixer, you're pulsing off and on. Now, just a little final story. I work so much with the gluten-free flour. I don't have any celiac anything. Like I have no gluten sensitivities. But with that testing, I developed a sensitivity to the gluten-free flours. I'm like and the other tester did too. Isn't that wild?
Interesting. I haven't even heard about something like that.
Well, I gotta break ground. It's what I do.
All right, Anna slid a question in. You mentioned sifting. So, Colette, do you always sift the dry ingredients?
No. When I don't need to, I don't. But sifting is a very, very important step for cakes. It helps with lightness. I would sift for cakes. I would sift for muffins, cookies, anything that's kind of small and where we're not looking for cookies. I might whisk. I do get upset. Like I get my nose gets all out of joint when I see blogs and bakers out there and they're not sifting at all. We can't give up sifting. And like Sheila with her cinnamon pie dough, she can't just throw that cinnamon in there and whisk. We got to make sure that cinnamon gets broken up. So I would definitely sift. Where we don't need to sift, bread, yeasted doughs, and when we're making pâte à choux, cream puffs or eclairs, that dough that goes in the pot like that, and then we put on the mixer or we pretend it's 1790 and we add in the eggs with a big old wooden spoon. That is that we don't sift that dough.
Okay, I think we have time for a few more questions. Let's go in next to Taylor's. Taylor says, when you would bake your pie before heading to a party, when is the best time to do it? Do you want to do it the day before, 2 days before? What do you think?
If you have the oven space, do it the morning of. If you don't, do it sort of end of day of the day before.
Okay, and then Megan's got a question about altitudes. Is there a difference in pie crust recipes for lower versus higher altitudes?
It depends how high you are. Mm-hmm. And if you're over like 50, like Denver, like 5280, then one of the best sources, kingarthur.com high altitude, is one of the best definitive sources for, I think it's just a great little posting about how to work with high altitude. Now with pie crust, we don't have a lot of modifications because we have no chemical leavener, and we have no yeast, and we have no proofing. So there isn't a ton of variation, but you just want to do a refresh. If you've just moved to a high altitude, kingarthurflour.com, high altitude, just download that, give it a quick read, just so you're up on like what you're dealing with. Because high altitude, I've always lived at sea level. I've coached high altitude. It's a whole new, it's totally doable. And I'm sure there's people watching that are like, yeah, I got this. But, but I don't mean to scare you at all. You just need awareness.
All right, let's do Anna's question. So the exact opposite of Taylor's question. Taylor wanted to know before you host and serve. Anna wants to know after. What do you think about storage for these pies that we're making?
Refrigerator. Refrigerator. Yeah. Even an apple pie, if it sits on the counter too long, it'll start to ferment. I mean, if it's going to be eaten in a couple hours, but I actually tried it, and after a day and a half, because that how do I, if I'm gonna be an expert, I'm gonna be an expert. So I've tried it with apple pie, and after a day and a half, the apples were fermenting, and that was in a 73-degree kitchen. I keep a thermometer in my kitchen and in my refrigerator so that I always know where things are, you know.
Okay, a few more product questions I think we could slide in really quickly before I give you the floor for some final thoughts. So first, have you, or has any of our viewers, if you want to drop this in the chat box if you're viewing, used an Instapot to make pie?
Full disclosure, Leah, no. Cheesecake like crazy, but why not? Try it. However, if it is the Thanksgiving pie, you might want to do a rehearsal, you know. I mean, the Instapot is marvelous. It's just, ooh, cheesecake in the Instapot's really, really good. So yeah, work it. You bought it. It's taken up real estate in your kitchen. Use it, but do a run through. That's my 2 cents.
All right, and our last question that we're going to take today is, Twyla wants to know, what do you use for sifting? We talked about sifting those dry ingredients. What do you recommend?
Well, you have options. I actually use, like, it's probably 14 inches. It's like a strainer on a frame, and it's about 14 inches in diameter. So I can sift over a large bowl. So in France, they're called tamis, Tamis. We call them strainers. I have kind of given up on this one, like the old fashioned one. It's really charming, but even the big ones, the hole is just not big enough. So more like a strainer, and they do make them specifically for baking. There was a company, I think, called, oh my God, Chef and Such. I feel like I need to have my computer open. And they had this they had this really great one. I'm sure we could find it on Amazon. Oops, I can't leave you. I feel like I just left you. Leah, I can't leave you. I can't click out.
No, please don't.
So I would do some research, and I know I use it in some of my videos, but I will, you know what I'll do? Since we've talked about my website, bakingwithcolette.com, I will curate a small post about products we talked about in today's Craftsy chats, and I will post them. And so you could, with links, and, instead of my just babbling.
That's a fantastic idea, and it also leads me into what I wanted to ask you last. So Colette, I know even before we went live, you were talking a little bit about what's coming up for you. I'd love for you to remind our viewers where they can find you. We do have the link to Baking with Colette already in the chat box, but where else can they find you on social media, and what can we be looking forward to from you in the future?
Well, thank you so much. You can find me, again, website, bakingwithcolette.com, Instagram, bakingwcolette. I couldn't get the with. That's also my Twitter handle, but I haven't done much on Twitter. I am working on debuting a small series on Instagram called The Dough Doctor. So watch for that. That'll be happening on IGTV hopefully in about 10 days. And I will be back on Craftsy December 14th with a live demo on making, we're going to use the recipe from Danish from scratch, and we're going to make cream cheese cherry Danish for the holidays.
Ooh, that sounds fantastic. So thank you so much, Colette. That is the end of our time, and we got to as many questions as possible, but we always come back for more Craftsy chats. So if you had a question that didn't get answered, or you just really love it and you want to come back another time, don't worry, we won't be gone too long. So again, my name is Leah. We had Colette Christian with us today. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Craftsy chats. Please come back and see us for the next one. Until then, good luck baking all of your pies. Happy baking and happy crafting.
Happy Thanksgiving.